are gathering here today because we have a formidable writer, storyteller, marketer, but most importantly, an all right, nice guy. Khaya Dlanga is here, everyone, and welcome, Khaya.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Life is like that sometimes.
Yeah.
And I've only read the other two. And throughout all the works I've read, and you also write a lot on social media.
Yes.
There are times when you actually go in, which is really lovely. But I found that this was one of the most vulnerable pieces of work that you've ever produced. Was that something you thought hard about?
I didn't think about the fact that, okay, I want this to be more vulnerable. I think it's because I was feeling vulnerable, I think, at the time when I wrote that book. In fact, I had started writing this book before my mother passed.
Really?
Yeah, and then she passed, and then I just stopped writing. And to my publisher's good graces, she did not terrorize me and asking me, and because she has this tendency of saying, we've got a deadline, and this is when you need to submit the book. And this time she said nothing for I think over a year. Didn't say anything, trying to get me to write. And
so you say you started writing before your mother passed.
Yes.
Did you start writing exactly where you started writing the book?
Yes, but then I rewrote quite a lot of stuff. I revisited quite a bit of stuff.
I really am intrigued by that because if you haven't seen the book, the very first thing that Khaya goes into is death, your father.
Yes.
So you started there before your mother passed on.
I think the reason was also because I'd also fairly recently lost my brother as well. And maybe death was in my mind at the time. And so even though when I wanted to, in fact, my intention was actually to write this book to be a lot more like these things really do happen to me. So I wanted to be more lighthearted and short stories and be more like that book. And then when I lost my mother, I think that plan kind of didn't work. Not that my mother's death is funny, but...
I mean, you've struck a really nice balance because there is a lot of grief, but lots of funny moments. Let's start with your father. How much do you remember of your father?
I only have one single memory of my father. The single memory I remember is him at my grandmother's house, his parents' house, because they had separated. Maybe that he'd left. So they had separated. He'd left and forgot that he had a wife and kids. And so my mom went back to her family. And this memory I have is me being a baby. Maybe I'm 3, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years old. And there's this man who's holding me, like this. And is holding me, but behind my grandmother's house. And my mom and my aunt had arrived in a car. And back in the 80s, 2 women driving a car was a big thing. And I could see that my mom, she was I don't know how I remember this memory, but she was dressed to the nines and so on. I think they would just say, I want to see what you're missing. And my father felt like he was almost using me as a means of protecting himself from my mother. I don't know if that makes sense. It felt like he was shielding maybe himself from the wrath that he could be getting, from being an absent father, not being around. But there was a smallness that I detected in him and an embarrassment, I suppose, at the same time, because he was aware of how he was just not present, for his children. And that's the only memory I have of him.
And so what does it do to you when everybody that you come across, especially in your family, says you look just like your father, which they do?
Yeah. So what that did to me is, and I don't think you realize that and I also talk about him as the man from the past tense. And the reason I refer to him as the man from the past tense is because I didn't remember who he was. Everybody talked about this man. And they'd say that, oh, because also when he passed away, no one came to me and said, your father has passed on. And it's something that you kind of figure out over time, because everyone talks about this man in the past tense. And they say, oh, you look like so-and-so. Oh, he used to be, he used to laugh like this. Oh, he used to walk like this. And he was, and eventually you kind of think, oh, flip, this person they keep saying used to be or was is no longer alive, and this man is my father. And then a part of me just wanted to emulate this mythical figure that everyone was kind of talking about, because I heard stories about how he was like, no one would mess with him, and he'd fight anybody, and he was a legendary stick fighter. There's a great story that I've heard of him where they went to a neighboring village with some boys from this village, and they were going to stick fighting, and it's a thing that boys did back in the day. And so they went to this village, and so they charged. And then when he looked back, he realized that all of his friends had fled. And it was just him fighting all these other guys by himself. So, and this legendary story was about him, across 5 villages, about how he withstood, fight one man against all these other guys. And so I was like, oh, flip. And I actually became pretty aggressive, I think, as a child, because I wanted to be like this legendary figure that everyone kept talking about. And you would not see me turn away from any fight. I was in constant fights. I was beating up people.
You were smoking weed at 8.
I was smoking weed. That is true, because there was weed growing in the village. And so and people always laugh at me when I said that by the time I was 10, I'd quit smoking weed. But which is very true. And my quitting weed was not intentional. It's because I went to a boarding school.
And got into more trouble there.
So so that's why I had this I had this kind of this weird aggression where I thought what it meant to be him and what it meant to be a man was to be this man who did not turn away from a fight. And that's what that did to me. So I created this image, of because I wanted to be like that person. And there's another story where there's a story that I love in the book where we have because my grandfather loved his horses, and this horse called Ubaibile, and I wasn't alive, when my mom actually told me this story. She wrote it to me, I think, when she was sick, and telling me this story about my grandfather. And there was a family in Ziza, this mountain that we used to have, would send our cattle and some of our horses to graze, certain periods of the year. And it's like a 6-7 hour trek there and 6-7 hour trek back. So it's long. And one day someone came to tell my grandfather that Ubaibile, his favorite horse, has gone missing. And then he sent my mother, who was I think 14 at the time, and another relative to go, to this village to look for the horse. And they went from village to village looking for this horse until I think on the day, 4th day, I think they were going to give up, looking for this horse. And they were walking past some homestead where there were lots of horses, and there was a celebration, some kind of celebration. And my mom kind of saw a horse that looked like my grandfather's horse. But it was, so my grandfather's horse was white. But then this horse was, I think, dark gray or brown, right? I think that's brown. And my mom was like, and she looked and she saw, wait a minute, and it's got horseshoes, and it's the only horse with the horseshoes because no one else had horseshoes. And then, so she called out. There's a particular, like my grandfather used to call out his horses in a very particular. Each horse had its own kind of call. And Baibile, hey Baibile, when so he kind of call like that. And then my mom did this, and then the horse heard, and he kind of like raised his, and his ears, and it starts, rolling and stuff. And that's when my mom was like, whoa, I think that this is the horse, but it's a different color. So she can't walk into this celebration. It's a big family, and so they went back to the family where they were going to, where they were staying while they were looking for the horse. And when she got there, my grandfather, because they hadn't come back, in like 3 days, so he was there. They found him, and my mom told the story, and my grandfather was like, "Okay, great, I'll come with you." He got on his horse, and they got on another horse, and they went to this neighboring village. And my grandfather did the same thing, and the horse, and I was like, "Okay, that's my horse." And he went to that family, and they said, "Hey, I want the men of this house." And then the men came, and they said, "Oh, actually, you own this house." Said, "I've heard that you are a very famous thief. I know you're a very famous thief. This you are not going to do to me. You've stolen my horse." And this guy said, "No, I would never do that. I could never steal anyone's horse." And my grandfather says, "What if I can prove to you that like one of these horses here is mine?" And he says, "I can tell, you'll never." So my grandfather goes and he does. And he says, "That's my horse." And he says, I don't know how this happened." And then my grandfather said, "So are you telling, how did this horse, if you didn't steal it, why is it a different color? Does this horse have like hands that it painted itself?" Like, how? And then at that point, then and then this man is like, "No, I don't know what happened." And so my grandfather said, "Listen, this is what you're going to do. You're going to give me back my horse. Then you are going to slaughter his sheep. You are going to give me this sheep. And then you are," I forgot what the third thing that he said he wanted to do. And basically he was like, and literally these guys did that. And he was one man and with 2 kids. And an entire group of men, because they didn't want him to call in the cops and all of that. But also because they knew like his power, like I think in the area, which is why they kind of gave it to him. And I suppose, and what I talk about for me, the lesson that I learned from that one, this story that my mother told, was he was a person of one integrity, and not only integrity, he was not afraid of confronting a difficult situation, regardless of who was there, because your dignity as a person is important, and I feel that when people stand up for themselves, when they feel that their dignity has been impacted, people will respect you. Even if it's reluctant, they will respect you. And I think it's important to, to make sure that your dignity is intact and that you handle business when you need to.
We continue our conversation with Khaya Dlanga. It's our special event, and everyone is still here. The drinks are flowing, the food is happening. It's really a wonderful evening. So next time, if you want to be a part of this, go to our platform, Khaya959, go to the book club, and then register there, and you'll get all our invites. So the book is called Life is Like That Sometimes, and we have Khaya in studio. Your mom is everywhere in these pages. Everywhere. And I tried to put her in a bit of a box in trying to define her for myself, and I realized I couldn't. How do you describe your mother?
That's actually, I think that's a very good way of describing her. Like you said, you couldn't put her in a box because she was like this defiant woman, I think, in her time. There's a story that I'll never forget where this, elderly uncle of mine told me how my mom went, from East London, went to Joburg looking for my father because he was not going home. And because he was not going home, her in-laws thought that he was not going home because he was scared of her. So when she came, and she was like, I'm going to go and she didn't know where he worked. So, and she went to some factories, I think in Germiston, and she went to this factory, and there was someone who happened to be from, a relative, like this man. And she says, and when he told me this story, he says, hey, and I saw and the bona no mazali ngobe blue and because she's like, why is this freak girl wearing pants? Like, what's wrong with her? You know what I'm saying? And what is crazy is like, this is someone who was in Joburg, and she was shocked back then seeing a woman wearing pants. And this is what my mom was like. She was just like, I don't care what people think. I am going to be, who I am. And there's another story that I remember, like when I was quite young. I must have been I don't know, maybe I was 9, 10, I don't remember. And she came home, and because she lived in East London, which is 6 hours away from Mount Aleph. And so she'd come and visit us once a month. And she came and she said that she wanted to visit some relatives in a neighboring village. And she was going to get she would go do so by riding my grandfather's horse. And this is a thing. Women, there was no rule that said women shouldn't ride horses, but women just didn't ride horses.
Yeah.
It was just like a thing that wasn't done.
Yeah.
And my grandfather's like, you want to ride the horse? And my grandfather's like, okay, whatever. So now I was there brushing the horse, putting the harness on and putting everything. And I'm like, I was like, okay, this is interesting. And the next thing, my mom gets on the horse and she goes to the neighboring village. The entire village, when I say the entire village, people are standing on the road looking at her like this. They just couldn't believe that this is a woman on a horse. Like, what the heck is going on? And so this was my mother. She was also the very same person who, when I was, she sent me to this school called Little Flower Junior Secondary School. And that's this Catholic boarding school in Gombe. And when she wanted, you were only allowed to speak like the first term, okay? I'd say like the first month, okay? You are there, you are allowed to kind of 80% of your conversation, maybe not 80%, let's say 60, could be Xhosa, and the rest English. And then the next month, it should be like 60% English, 40% Xhosa. Third, like by the end of the term, should be 20% Xhosa, 80% English, okay? And anyway, so by the time I left the school, there's a very funny story there. By the time so now during school holidays, if I was in East London and my mom would see, this is just before the end of apartheid, and she sees white kids playing, she's like, I'm. And so now I'd have to go and talk to these freaking white kids because my mom was like, listen. And she said, listen, you're going to work with white people one day. And I don't want you being scared of these people. So you got to start training now. And I was like, oh my God.
But your mother, as you point out, was not loud.
No, she was not.
But she insisted she did not want a child onyabile.
Yes.
There's an entire chapter on you are not supposed to be a nyabile child.
Oh, yeah. I think I know that this word is in Xhosa. I don't know about that other languages. Ukonyaba. It is a word that you do not want anyone to describe you as. And ukonyaba.
Oslaparach.
Yeah. It's like, how can I describe it? It's like
you are dull.
You are so dull and lifeless that, like, if snot fell down, you would lick it. Because you don't have the foresight to clear. You know what I'm saying? Because, you know what I'm saying? I think you can understand this kind of person. You see, you can picture this person. And for her, ukunyaba meant that you had an inherent inability to stand up for yourself. And it is not aggressive. It is about the fact that I am worth something, right? And therefore, I can stand up for myself. Because if unyabile, the world is going to take advantage of you. And so she did not want umntana onyabileyo because she did not want to have to fight your battles for you, because you have to learn to fight your battles when she is not around, because most of the time you are not going to be there with someone who's going to fight your battles for you. And that's what ukunyaba, it's a thing that many Xhosa parents will, and that's why I think that lots of Xhosa people come across as extroverted. It's not because it's by choice. It's because you are kind of raised. In fact, people it's not uncommon to hear some hey and then it's like, oh, and now you have to be
get your energy
you gotta
up.
get your energy up and get your act together. And my mother, like you said, she was not a loud person, but she had presence. She had dignity, and she was also an amazing storyteller. She was a fantastic storyteller.
Yeah.
But she'd always pretend that she doesn't want to tell the story. She'd always be like, you'd be like, oh, can you tell me a story? She'd be like, oh, hi man, don't candiege. And then it's like, but then she'd start slowly, and then she'd go and she'd get into it, and then she's animated and she's standing up and she's performing and people are laughing and all of that. So she was that kind of person who was, she was a great storyteller. And I think that lesson, but she did not. Oh, there's a story actually. I have to tell this one, where my mom were in Durban. This is again towards the tail end of apartheid, and my sister and I. So she'd taken us on holiday, and she was getting seawater from my grandmother. It's like early in the morning, and we're going back we're going back home that morning. And she was on the rocks, and at some point that this freak wave out of nowhere just came and swept her, and I couldn't see her for a good 5 seconds. And I thought she was just gone. And by the time the waves has subsided, she was there on her back and on the rock, and I thought she was dead. So I got up and I went down the embankment, and I got there, and when I got there, she was just unconscious. And she was bleeding, from the back of her head, just bleeding profusely. And then I saw, it's very early in the morning, maybe that's at 7 a.m. And I saw this white couple walk past, and the only English word I knew at the time was, my name is, and help. And I shouted, help, help. And they just walked past. They looked and they just walked past. And I just couldn't understand, because where I came from, when I saw a child in trouble, you helped. You didn't ask questions. And then a few minutes later, another couple walked past, white people, looked, just walked past. And I just couldn't understand what was happening. And then, obviously, I'm holding her, and I'm saying, I didn't call her mom, I called her auntie, because my cousins are older than me, and they called her auntie, and therefore I called her auntie myself. And so I was like, Vuga auntie, and I'm crying. And then at some point she woke up. And so when she told me this story, how when she woke up, she said, I cannot die. Who is going to look after my children? Who is going to educate my children? Because there's no one there. It's just me. And it almost feels like she willed herself, out of death.
Whatever was happening.
Whatever was happening at the time, she was she said she felt like life slipping away from her. But then she was still by the children.
I was struck by how you processed grief throughout the book. From when you speak about your father, almost like it's not a thing. He's gone. Nobody said anything. You realize later, okay, he's gone. Your grandmother passes on, who was actually your mother, in a sense, the person you saw every day. that changed you somewhat.
Yes.
Not just you, your grandfather too.
Yeah, it's true. My grandfather literally became a pale shadow of who he was. Like, he was not this man, that I think that he just couldn't grasp, because also, like, her death was very sudden. And so, and I think I was completely unprepared for it. And my grandmother was just always there. She was also this very kindly, gentle woman who, even though she was kindly and gentle, she was also the very same woman who, when I was fighting some boy was hitting my sister, and then I tried to fight him, and then I fell, and then he scratched my face, and then I ran home to my grandmother because, like, my grandmother's going to beat this boy. And when I got to my grandmother and I told her that, like, this boy scratched my face, and she said, okay, what must I do now? Go and fight. And so, anyway, that was my grandmother. But so even with her, like, I actually became quite rebellious. So I didn't know this was happening to me at the time. I became very rebellious. I smoked weed. I stopped going to school. I was banking. Can you imagine? You're 8 years old and you're banking. And I was out here, and I would literally be so bored. That's so funny. I don't know why I was banking, because I was very bored. So I'd sit there and then by the school and I'd watch. And I'd be watching to see what's going on, and I'm hoping no one catches me, And one day, actually, I think I fell asleep, and then some boys and then I kind of grabbed my bag and I ran so fast. And so in the village, there are ihanga, these little alleyways. And because people don't want cattle walking through the alleyways and start, grazing, and so they have like this wire so that they don't walk through the alleyway. And I just ran without looking, and I actually have this gigantic scar, like right here on my chin, that and I just hit, and I fell so far back, and I started bleeding so profusely. I don't know what lie I told when I got home, but this was me banking. And so, like, I was really this, and my mother, actually, when she came back, I didn't know this. She told me years later that when she came to visit, and she's like, this child is not the same. This child is just, I cannot leave. If I leave this child for another term in this village, he's gone. His life is never going to be the same. And that's when she took me to Little Flower Junior Secondary School.
Where you became a menace as well.
Yeah.
Somewhat. I want you to think about, all the lessons that you've just spoken of, and how you then draw the dots to how they assisted you in your corporate life, where you had to stand up to a boss who was, I don't know whether she was going through her stuff, but nonetheless quite rude.
Yes.
But as a young person walking into that environment, where you remembered the lessons from your grandmother, your grandfather, your mother about standing up for yourself.
Yes. I work for a massive corporate organization, and I'd gone to shoot some ad, and so we had some disagreement with my boss, and everyone was terrified of my boss. Everybody was terrified of her. You'd have, before someone walked into her office, they would pace up and down. That's how scared they were of her. Because she was very smart, very good at her job, but also terrifying. So people would pace up and down, preparing themselves, and they'd go into, and when they come out, they were not the same. It was always like, okay, this is a tough woman. And so one day, we have this disagreement in the office, and she just starts speaking to me, and she goes off at me. And at that point, I stop her and I said, listen, you're not going to speak to me like that. You are not going to talk to me like that. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk out of this office, and I'll come back when we both calm down, and when we can both talk to each other with respect, and we both calm. Because one of us is going to say something they can't take back. And I walked out of this office, And I remember thinking, oh
You
God,
junior,
I'm
you.
going to be fired tomorrow. If not tomorrow, today. What have I done? So I walked out and I paced around. I was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? I went to the fridge and I grabbed water and I was like, oh my God. And I came back in the office and she was literally sitting like this. And there was another guy who was reporting to me who was sitting there. And he was also in trouble. And when she shouted at him, and I said, no, I told him to do that, right? And then, they're both sitting like this, but they don't know what to do. And then I came back with a very calm conversation. And our next one-on-one, she asked me to to tell her what I thought her shortcomings were and how she could improve. And she literally had a notepad and she was writing things down. And everything I was telling her, people are scared of talking to you. People don't walk in, they pace up and down people in office. You shout at people. People don't speak out speak in meetings because they're worried you're going to shoot down what they're saying. And I'm saying all of these things. And maybe if you do this, and I could see her after that making a very deliberate and cautious effort not to be that person. And I think it's because no one had actually done that to her. No one had stood up to her and said, listen, this is not how you deal or you talk to people. Because sometimes we say people are terrible, but also we don't let them know that they are being terrible, but in a certain kind of way. And so they think that like the behavior, you normalize the behavior that that becomes ingrained in them, because actually in reality they are not that person. Because what ends up happening is that the only thing that you see about who they are is that. And you become blind to every other possibility of who they actually are.
Yeah.
And simply because of that, because that characteristics becomes a dominant feature of who they are and what you see in who they are. And so that was quite a thing. And again, I don't know if I hadn't been taught ubandinga nyabi, if I wouldn't have been able to do that, right? Because again, like corporate South Africa, very white, and there were, I'm talking, these are white people who were scared of standing up to this other white person, and I had to do it. So I just think that, there are just lessons in life you learn from your childhood that you don't know are lessons. Yeah.
So I was going through the same grief as you on the pages. Your mother's grief, your brother's grief. And there's no competition, but I couldn't tell which was worse, actually. Because there's something to be said about, and you'll tell me if this resonates, losing a sibling. It just shouldn't happen. You're young. I suppose there's a bit of guilt there as well. Why am I the one who survives? Especially because you're older. Have you processed it differently over time?
That's actually a very good question. Have I processed it differently over time, or have I just gotten used to it? For context, my brother was living with me, and I had no idea this gambling problem, this online gambling thing. I had no idea what it was, and long story. I kicked him out of my place because things went missing and stuff like that. And when he eventually owned up to tell me that, okay, he's gambling, and he worked, where I worked, and the problem was recurring, and the only thing that I asked of him was, whatever happens, if you gamble again, just say, listen, I gamble again. I'll be irritated. It's an addiction. It's an illness. It's not you. You're sick, right? So don't make this about you. That's all I ask. I was like, just don't lie when you do it again. That's all I want from you. And so when he kind of, it's a very long story, how I dealt with this. And so the one time I got so mad at him, I said, listen, tomorrow morning, I'm kicking you out of my place. I'm going to Joburg. We lived in Cape Town. I'm going to Joburg. I'll come back on Monday. And and I gave him, when I kicked him out, I gave him money. But I also didn't, I was like, if I don't give him money, what is he going to eat? Because he's got nothing. Right? But then what if he uses money to gamble? Right? But I can't not leave him with anything. So I was having this and also I had this Nando's black card that, I could use for free anyway.
You one of very few people.
Yeah. And so, but anyway, then when I was in Joburg, I received a phone call that he'd taken his life. And I literally, I remember getting the phone call, and I don't know why. Maybe it's the brain that does this for you to protect you. I just jumped into action, which was okay. I started giving instructions to people. Okay, you're going to do this. You're going to do that. You do this. You do that. And obviously, afterwards, like, the guilt that I felt was, it's hard to put into words. And making decisions also became so difficult because I felt like I made a decision that caused him to make a decision, like a final and terminal decision. And
just for context, I think it's important to point out, and you're not going to do this, you had done everything. So Khaya had gotten him the therapies. Everybody at work was willing to assist, to give him time off. He had been to rehab. All of the things were provided for him, including you taking him back after having sold all the televisions, the iPads. So all of that had happened. It's not as if it was a one day you wake up and you say leave.
Yeah.
A lot had happened in the interim.
Yeah, a lot had happened. And I remember my mom actually sent me in fact, he, in his suicide note, he wrote that you did more than a brother should do.
Including him, getting him a job and all of that stuff.
Yeah. And
do you think that's possibly what sped up your mom's illness?
I have no question about it. It definitely because she was very healthy. She was fine.
Yeah.
And then one day, I'll never forget I was like, I don't want to talk to my mother when my brother passed away. I said to my sister, I'm not going to talk to her. I can't, because what if she blames me? Like, what if she thinks that I am the one who pushed him towards this? Because it's what I was feeling, I guess.
And he was living with you.
And he was living with me. And I was like, I can't. And then she was very calm. I spoke to her, and she was so calm. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And she's taking it better than I thought she was, and she was really relaxed, and then the only time I saw her break that character that she was obviously playing, I think, for all of us and for me, and I think maybe she was playing it especially for me, so that I didn't feel that I had done anything wrong, and I don't feel the guilt. And I think that's what she was doing. And I remember when we were walking out of crematorium, because in the suicide note he did say that he wanted to be cremated, and my mother was leading the procession, and I was walking behind her, and when she got to the hearse, which was in the front of the crematorium, she kind of threw her hand on it, and she just I saw her crying for the first time, and just the second time actually at the church. I saw her kind of like curling over herself like that, and I could just like this wave, like the crying that feels like it's a wave, it's coming in waves. And I took it to the car, and that evening, this part, I hate mentioning this part because I'm not gonna cry, and And she then, like that evening, it was myself and my sisters, just us, my mother and my two sisters, in the house, and we're watching TV, and as I describe it, a TV that no one is really watching. And then my mom, like just out of the blue, she kind of said in a soft voice, I was like, "Ndizakufa kulo nyaka uzayo." Yeah. And then, so I got very angry at her, and I was like, "Why would you say that? Whatever, whatever I said to her." And then I thought maybe it was like a moment of like, I don't know, grief and weakness, and she was just saying it. And then later she said that, well, her mother, who lost a son, her mother died the year after she lost a son. And I think for her, she was saying, maybe experiencing what her mother felt. And she was like, okay, I understand what my mother was going through, and this is what I'm feeling now. And then, well, she didn't die, that next year, but she got very sick, like out of the blue. Like, this is a woman who was in her 60s, like doing skipping rope, and then she just got very sick, deteriorated so fast. And I think that she knew she was sick, and she hid it from us. And I think that she just couldn't bear the thought of having, had to bury her youngest child. I think that, she I don't know if she prophesied her death or she called it upon herself. And I feel that she probably called it upon herself because she just couldn't bear living with the grief. And also she wrote the most gracious letter. It's such a gracious letter. When my brother passed away, it's funny because when I was reading the letter that she wrote, because it was going to be read at the funeral, I didn't feel anything because I was doing logistics. It's about, okay, are the toilets here? Is this happening? Okay, what does the program look like? And she gives me a speech and it's like, I don't know why I'm meant to approve this thing. Like, I'm not approving a speech. Okay, whatever. But then when I was read at the church, I realized how profoundly painful and gracious and kind it was. She literally said that things like the pain of this world has, you couldn't live with the pain of this world. Go well, my son. And you don't expect that from a black parent in this day to be saying something like that when their child has taken their life. Because we have a tendency to want to hide this fact. And there's a shame to it, that unfortunately that people have, that they said they won't talk about suicide in their families. And even in her letter that was read, she said that there were times when you were in your room and you'd be in your room for so long that I'd ask your sister to go and look to make sure that you're still alive. Kungathi kanti uzibulele. And it would turn out to be so eventually. So I thought it was a very gracious and kind thing for her to do.
One of the things that struck me was that, of course, we are working people. There is life, and then there's family, and there's work that takes 80% of our time. And the people that you work with are actually your family.
Yes.
Essentially. And they became that for you. But I also wondered how you felt about, especially with your mother, tearing yourself between work, her, the commitments that you still had, wanting to be back home. How did you process that?
I think that it was actually, I think because work was so, it was kind of very family-like. And I think that's why I didn't really, but also like I suppose there was COVID that happened at the same time when my brother passed away. COVID. So we buried my brother on the Saturday. Ramaphosa shut down the country on Thursday.
Well, thank you for staying with us. The author is called Khaya Dlanga. You know him from his wonderful tweets, sometimes very long, but his wonderful tweets. In fact, there was a tweet. No, it's no longer a tweet. Is it a tweet? It's a post.
Oh, okay.
It was a post. Your most recent post, was it on Instagram?
Okay.
That was quite compelling. Like last week?
Maybe.
You don't.
I don't remember. What was
I'll have to open it up. But it was an entire essay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll remember now. But it had something to do with you explaining certain terminologies. I'll have a look. What was it about again?
It was actually in December. Mikiti.
Yes. Okay.
The meaning behind a lot of things.
I remember that.
Because it was because I felt that a lot of people
must misunderstanding how we do what we do and what certain things mean.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So Khaya then writes this emotional book, and he reminds us, by the way, that while he grew up very hard, he's got a scar. I meant to ask you about the hand, your left palm, whether you still have the scar where you dug yourself.
Oh my goodness!
Completely.
Yeah, no, it's around. You can't see it
because you are being a big boy.
Surgery.
And he reminds us that he would never be that strong anymore because he's very soft. His hands are very soft now. So while you are very soft, you do still feel I suppose the job of being an activist, of being somebody who calls out certain things. So what he does in this book, he writes a lot of wonderful things, and then he reminds us, buy the book, okay? Especially those who have the means to buy books, and we have struggling artists, struggling authors, and we're not doing right by them. What was that about?
That was about... I think that there were two things that I felt I needed to address in the beginning of the book, which was that there is a tendency, I think, because it's strange, maybe it's changing now, that most people who buy books in the country are white people, even though we are majority black country, and black people aren't buying books, right? And then because, black people aren't really maybe buying as many books as one would hope they should, then the book buying public, which is mostly white, was not necessarily buying black writers. And there needs to be an interest in the white buying public to buy black books, right? Because we have almost an inherent understanding of white life because we sit on TVs, we read about it and all of that, right? And we've been reading in high school the books about white people and so on, right? But white people didn't seem to be making a conscious and deliberate effort to buy books about black lives. And that's what I was addressing. But then at the same time, I suppose what I need to address is the fact that I think that also, us black people who do have the means to buy books should buy books and support the storytelling that is being told by other black people. Because I remember many years ago being at an event where Thabo Mbeki was, that just kicked him out of the presidency. And I was invited, to some round table discussion. And the one thing that I'll never forget him saying, and this was before I'd written any book in my life, and he said that the problem is that we don't tell our stories. Our stories are told by other people, and what this means is that we end up seeing ourselves through the lens of other people. And then we see ourselves according to how someone else defines us. And then we think there is a truth about who we are. And so if we do not support black writers, you'll have fewer black writers. And then not only will you have fewer black writers, because if they don't see commercial incentive for doing what they're doing, then they don't feel the need to carry on writing. They'll go on to other pursuits. Yes, some of us are not, we're not, we have other.
You don't
things.
depend.
We don't
on,
depend
on this work.
We don't depend on this work.
Yeah.
So that's useful, but we want to be able to have quite a substantial number of writers who do not need to do something else in order for them to be able to have, because, no, not just anything, but a lot of actors, I think that they can sustain themselves, maybe not as much as they would like to, but they can sustain themselves. But most writers, I can tell, are unable to sustain themselves, like in any shape or form.
Yeah.
And something that I've written about is that, like, to be a bestseller in South Africa,
20,000.
No, it's less, way less than that, right? It's
between 5 and 20,000.
Oh no, it's I promise it's way less. It is way less than that.
Yeah.
And so just to get on that list and to think how difficult it is for people to get into it. And I remember that there was some guy actually once wrote a blog after my second book, to quote myself. I wrote this book and he said, should I, as a white person, tell Khaya how to write a memoir? And so he wrote this long post about what was wrong with my memoir and how it should be written, and it goes off like that. And I remember my ego was obviously like, I was like, oh my God, this bruised me so much. And so I decided to write a rebuttal. And I said, part of the problem is that telling people how to tell their stories is part of gatekeeping. So you saying that, like, a story should not be told this way, and it's a way of saying that, well, you, because you're this kind. And then he said the reason my book was a bestseller, was on the bestseller list, was because I was black, and because South Africa is a majority black country. That's why. And so he goes off to say this. And then I was like, okay, actually, as emotional as I am, let me actually give him some facts. And I saw that year, I happened to see a list of, like, the bestsellers that year. And I think it was 85 books that made the bestseller list that year. And there were 3 black writers on that list, on the bestseller list. The 2, it was Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. It was I Write What I Like, Steve Biko. And the other one was Khaya Dlanga. And I always say, I don't want people to applaud that, because that should not be normal in a majority black country. Because why do you have such few? It makes no sense to me, right? And then I want to tell him, and I said, and do you know who's number last on that list? It was Khaya Dlanga on that list, number 83. So when you say that my book made the bestseller list because, I am black, is actually very lazy. It is part of you trying to create a narrative that is not true. Yeah. And to say that, to also discredit the fact that, like, somehow, but it's a miracle that I made that list, if you want to think about it, how things go. So I would really like to encourage, and sometimes I'm stuck between saying, well, should you buy black writers for the sake of buying them?
No. Or
should you buy them and also read? But I also think sometimes it is useful to buy them for the sake of buying them, because at some point you may pick up that book and read it. Or someone may come into your house and pick up that book and read it, right? And apparently about more than 6, what is it? It's like something like more than 60%, maybe 80% of households in this country have 3 books, only 3 books, right? And then there is a smaller percentage that has more than 20, more than 10, I think 15 or 10, and even, like, I think in the single digits, that has more than 50 books or 20 books in a home. So when children don't see books at home, they don't see a need to read books. And And so if you normalize having books in their home and normalize the children see, here, sorry, let me go for a little tangent. I saw Steve Jobs. He said that his kids, they're not on their, they, like all the billionaires, by the way, they don't let their kids, they force them to read books. They force them to read things about art. They have philosophical conversations and discussions at home. Do you know why? Because knowledge is in books. And where you get to find out who you are is in books. And where you find out what you stand for is in books. And if we are distracted and we distract ourselves with these things, right? And we're not going to go anywhere. And so I would really, and I don't care what kind of book you read. I used to read Mills and Boons, right? When I was in school, and I read it, and I'm not afraid to admit it. But that got me to read other books too.
But just tell us what the trick is, because you admit to having to hate reading even when your mother insisted on it.
Yes.
And so what would be the thing to encourage young people? Because we are competing with gadgets and all the other 101 streaming platforms and the free web and YouTube and everything else.
Force them. It's that simple, because I didn't like to read. But also what was interesting was that because my mom made me read, and I was like, oh, there's this thing called apartheid. Oh, this is why it happened. And I found myself more curious about what I was finding out about the world as I was reading. And I think for me that you'll be surprised how interested kids will be if you expose them. Yeah. And I mean, the billionaires are taking away the phones from their kids and iPads and giving them books. So, or just make sure your kids are scared of you. And for me, and I can tell you, and that's what happened to me. Like I was too scared of my mother not to read when she asked me to read books, and then I fell in love with reading.
I'm going to ask you to kind of give us your parting shot. And the parting shot I'm going to ask you about is why you thought it was important to write this book. Writing is your thing. Telling stories is what you do for a living. That's not a problem. But why this book was important for you?
This book helped me process my grief. And that's what it was a selfish book, I think, in that sense, because it was really about me. And a lot of the time, I've said this before to my sisters, is that a part of me almost feels guilty that they weren't able to do the same thing that I did, to write it, to write what they were feeling, or describing things that they went through, and so. So for me, it was important just to, and I think it managed to get me to a in my grieving process. I think it took me to like a stage that took me maybe further than it would take someone who didn't do the same thing, and that's what I think writing did for me. So it was a very selfish part in that regard. So
I would encourage you, if you've been listening to the conversation, to get yourself a copy. It's called Life is Like That Sometimes. And I want to end it with this particular note before we go to voice notes and before we take questions from the floor. In his words, Khaya says, as a final note, I hope this book reminds you that you are not alone in your joys or your sorrows. Life, as messy and unpredictable as it is, has a way of weaving beauty and meaning into even the hardest moments. And perhaps as you read, you'll find a piece of your own story within the pages. So that's what I would encourage you to do as I move to the floor for some questions. Yes, ma'am. Introduce yourself so people at home can hear you.
Hi, everyone. My name is
Hello.
Buku.
Hello.
Khaya, it's just been so interesting to see how beautifully and honestly you've written about grief. I want to know what has surprised you the most about how grief evolves over time.
What surprised me about grief over time is that it does not get better. That it stays. It does not go away. And you just get used to it. And literally, and that's it. That's all that happens. You get used to living with it. And I suppose that's what's a surprise to me. Because I thought, when people used to say that, it gets better with time. No, it doesn't. Because it will hit you unexpectedly. It will, I had I'll never forget, I had a funeral. My brother had already been buried. And then someone said to me, I was at a restaurant and I'm by myself and the waiter says, hi, how are you? And literally I could feel I was about to cry. And it's like, I was like, and the grief just someone simply saying, how are you? Right? And I don't even know where the grief, but it came, it visited. It doesn't ask you. Like, can I come in? It just comes in, right? And that's the one thing that surprised me most about grief. But, or when I say get used to it, I imagine it's like if you have ever lost, I don't know, you'd had like a painful tooth, right? And you chew on your right hand side. At some point, you're gonna, let me use my left. And then get used to that. So that's what grief is like. So you just get used to living with the thing. And I think it's the same. If it's like those people who someone used to have like a leg and they don't have a leg, they get used to living without the leg. They find ways to live and to make things happen. And that's the same thing as grief.
How has your whole experience affected all other areas of your life? Yes, that's my question.
In terms of, other areas of my life is obvious. I think that initially, like I said, there was a part where after my brother passed away, it was hard for me to make decisions because I'd made decisions and I thought that decision led to him, But have I healed? I think that it is a healing process. Grief is a healing journey. It's not you. I don't think you ever get to a point where it's like, I'm healed. It's a process. It's an absolute process.
How has it affected all areas of your life?
How it's affected other areas of my life. It's, I think that it really makes you appreciate, I think, people close to you, like quite a lot. And I think there are two things that you can do. You can either, one, find a way to close yourself because you think that you won't feel the pain because, but I think it's impossible to close that door. You can't. I think you're deceiving yourself when you think that, let me shut myself from too much affection so that I don't feel the pain. And then I would say that, that's, I don't have the answers, to be honest. I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out on a Tuesday.
I know, right?
And
Yes.
celebrating Khaya Dlanga. So thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you.